Have you seen this clip?
Who do you think you are? You haven't got a clue. £12,000 a year?
It's a conversation between James Hansen, who is a presenter on LBC, and LBC's like a talk show radio thing where people call up so that the hosts can call them idiots.
No, I don't need to give you an example.
You do, otherwise everyone's going to think you're very silly.
I listen to it because I suspect, like most people, I just enjoy winding myself up. But this clip in particular, it's kind of sad. A discussion about state pension that really goes to show the intergenerational conflict that exists across the population in this so-called United Kingdom of ours.
A pensioner should be on £20,000 a year. No, it's £12,000 a year.
£20,000 a year?
Yes.
But you haven't
absolutely.
paid in £20,000 a year over the course of your lifetime in taxes.
But there's one bit from James that really pricked my ears.
You hear this argument that, well, I've paid in all my life, so therefore I'm entitled to it. That doesn't apply to most pensioners. Most pensioners end up being net beneficiaries from the welfare state.
Is that true? Is Lynn getting more out than she put in? Will you get more out than you put in? I think we need to find out, don't we?
What makes you so special?
What makes us so special? It's you're unbelievable.
This is a paper from the Pensions Policy Institute. It looks to model how much NI are you going to pay in versus how much state pension you might get out. They go, okay, let's take males and females at the ages of 20, 40 and 60. We'll look at the top 10% of earners, middle earners and the bottom 10% of earners in each of those categories. And then we'll inflation adjust everything to 2022 figures. Because of course, someone who is 60 today will have paid a lot less in NI in nominal terms, the total amount on paper, because wages were so much lower when they were 20. They have these tables where they show all of the information and data, but my amazing editor is going to present it to you like this. It shows a pretty big trend. Almost everyone, according to this study, pays less NI than they get back in state pension. The only group who don't are 40-year-old men in the top 10% of earners. How? There's a few things going on here. First of all, if you're a lower earner or you have gaps in employment, but you still qualify for NI credits, or even if you're a director of a limited company where you often don't pay that much NI at all, it makes sense that you will pay in less than you get out. But what's going on for all of the workers higher up the earning spectrum? First of all, higher paid workers are expected to live longer than lower paid workers. The lowest male life expectancy in the UK is Blackpool, which is around 72 years old. And the longest life expectancy is Chelsea Kensington at around 86 years old. Chelsea also happens to be one of the richest places in the UK. That 14 years of extra state pension is £167,622. And it's a similar story to this across age groups as well. The 20-year-olds are probably going to be alive longer than the 60-year-olds today. So even though they pay more in NI over their lifetime, here are the 20-year-olds and 60-year-olds sat side by side so you can see the figures. The fact that the 20-year-old lives longer means they claw a lot of that back. See, it's not all that bad being young, guys. At least you're not a highly paid 40-year-old male. The perfect sweet spot between paying loads in, the state pension age rising as you're approaching it, and also just dying a bit younger than everyone else. It means that, they're the only group that are paying more than they get out. Thanks for your service, lads. I could joke about it because at this point I basically am one. But one area of this that I'm not going to be making any mildly offensive jokes about is the data on women. This is probably the only situation where lower earnings over a lifetime, gaps in employment due to motherhood, and the wealth gap actually pays off for women. Payoff is not the right way of saying it. I guess a silver lining, I suppose. Women in every demographic age range and wealth get more out of the state pension than they paid in versus the equivalent male of the same age. Women live longer on average, so there's that effect again. But it's also a reflection of what I just mentioned, this lower earnings over a lifetime, on average. Everything I'm talking about here is on average, doesn't apply to every individual, of course. But the state pension is a fixed amount at retirement, regardless of your gender. So that kind of drags that back for the women then because of those 2 points. So at a glance, it does look like James was right, that most people get more out than they paid in.
Most pensioners end up being net beneficiaries from the welfare state.
But hold on. I was going through this research thinking, how can this be? How can basically everyone get more out than they put in? What in the Ponzi is going on here? The whole thing seems to be resting on the shoulders of a small group of well-paid middle-aged men, the unsung heroes of our time. But then I realised a glaringly obvious issue with this data. It's missing a load of the numbers. One way I make sure I never miss any numbers is with today's video sponsor, Xero. As you can tell, I'm pretty obsessed with my finances. Staying on top of my numbers and making the most out of my money are things that I would class as a hobby to me. And Xero is the one tool that I use the most to manage my business finances. It literally runs the finances for the main channel, the podcast, and for the newsletter. We've got it everywhere. If you're a small business owner in the UK and you're not using Xero for your accountancy and bookkeeping, you should really check them out. I can see everything really easily at a glance: cash flow, profit, and loss. It even calculates my next VAT return down to the nearest penny. I use it to fire off invoices, pay bills, and it's dead easy to use. And I'm not just saying that. My mum uses it every day because she manages the books across the different businesses. And she isn't exactly the most tech-savvy person, even though she worked at an IT consultancy firm for years, but you know, don't know what's going on there. Xero is just so intuitive that it allows us all to spend minimal time on financial admin so I can focus on making content and growing my business. But it also makes me feel really in control of the money that's in my business. If you want to check out Xero, then check the link in the description for a special offer. Right, let's get back to the video. For every employee NI payment that you make, there is another one on the other side made by your employer, employer NI. It's the combination of these two that make up the total amount of NI that is paid. Now, you could quite convincingly argue, well, that's my employer, that's not me, and I want to know if I'm getting a good deal here, not them. But we should consider the employer stuff, I believe. The University of Oxford did a study into if you increase employer NI, how much of that feeds down to the employee in the form of lower pay increases. So basically, how much does this employer NI bit affect the employee? To quote the Oxford study, they found that the picture was nuanced. It's not a straight line that increases in employer NI affect employees' pay. The truth is there's probably a bit of everything going on here. Lower wage growth, a shift in hiring decisions, changes in prices, and the company's just swallowing the increase. But there is some effect. The PPI paper focuses solely on the NI paid by the employee. I don't think that that's misleading at all, and it certainly answers the question from one view anyway, but I do think that we should include the employer point too, because my view is that employer NI payment wouldn't exist if you weren't doing the work that you were doing. So it is relevant to your total contributions. I'm going to do some really clunky maths here, just to show you the potential impacts. Really, it's just a point of interest, no proper statistical analysis here. Let me just take a 21-year-old today, and here is the income levels that would put them in the bottom 10%, the middle, and the top 10% of earners. Here's the amount of employer NI that gets paid by their workplace in order to keep them employed. We're going to make sweeping assumptions and say that these 20-year-olds work for 45 years without any career breaks at all, apart from, holiday and all of that stuff. And, most importantly, they earn the exact same amount over their career the whole time. Highly unlikely, I know, but it just makes it easier. Here is the total amount of employer NI that will be paid to employ these people, and here is what the paper claims is the employee NI bill for these groups. Here's the two figures combined, and here is the revised percentage. The inclusion of these employer contributions changes the picture. From the vast majority of people over a working lifetime will pay in less than they get out, to the opposite. But there's one last consideration or caveat that I should make here. NI doesn't just pay for state pension. In theory, it pays for lots of other social care aspects, such as the NHS and things like this. The OBR estimates that we collect around 200 billion a year in national insurance contributions, and the most recent figures I could find is that state pension and also pension benefits cost around 150 billion a year. So how much NI you attribute to state pension in particular, is up for debate. But we can say there are two ways to frame this broadly. If you just look at the NI that people pay over a lifetime directly into the state pension system, then most people get out more than they put in according to the modelling by PPI. But when you consider the total NI picture, well, then the narrative changes. I'm going to keep saying this, but I have formed that narrative based on some sweeping assumptions, so you might make your own view on if that is the case or not. There's a lot of uncertainty there. What is certain, though, is that our state pension system is progressive. It redistributes money to areas of the society that are the lowest earning or that fell out of work. And in every example, lower earners get more out than they paid in. This is in keeping really with the design of the system originally. The Beveridge Report of 1942 described the state pension as a safety net. It ensures a base, certain level of income for all, but it also forms a really important part of the incomes of retirees across the wealth spectrum. The Pensions Policy Institute in a separate paper show how across the earning spectrum, the state pension is really an important foundational income for everyone to either depend on or build off. I think that's why this conversation is so sad. Two ends of the demographic spectrum with clear disdain for each other being ripped apart by a pension system that on one hand feels deserved yet inadequate, and on the other feels unsustainable and unlikely to be around when they get there.
You're wrong.
And also,
You're
Lynn,
wrong.
you say you should have retired at 60. I mean, that's ridiculous that you were ever able to retire at 60. 67 is a far fairer retirement age for both men and women, and frankly, it probably needs to rise further.
Well, I think you're absolutely disgusting. I really do.
I could end the video right here, try to answer the question as best as I could, but recently I've become really sick of content that I just see everywhere at the minute. My old content as well was a bit like this, where everyone is just, look how bad it is, here's all the problems, isn't it a disaster? Anyway, let's all have a moan and go on with our lives. No suggestions on how to fix things, no solutions. So instead of just ending here, I want to put forward a solution where I think that, my idea for how we can fix the pension system to remove this intergenerational war. Mainly so the intergenerational fighting can stop, or more so that we can build a more sustainable solution for the UK economy long term. Because the current path that we're on, where we have an ageing population and a triple lock promise, is not a good one. I'm not an expert, right? I'm just a guy from the north of England who cares about the country he lives in and has a platform online for some reason. I'll put forward my ideas, and what I welcome you to do is to pull them apart and critique them in the comment section. But all I ask from you is that you come up with some of your own as well and share them with everyone, and we can all have a read. Right, here it goes. The pay-as-you-go insurance-style nature of state pension mixed with an ageing population and declining birth rates stresses a system that basically pays out money as soon as it comes in. There is no pot attached to your name. We take from today's workers to pay yesterday's. That pay-as-you-go model ignores the biggest tool in retirement planning that we all have available to us, time, or compounding. So instead of passing contributions straight up the chain, why not build a system where today's money funds tomorrow's workers and then it grows over decades? There were approximately 650,000 children born in the UK last year. If at birth the UK government placed an amount, let's say £5,000, into a pension-like product for those children that they could never touch until they retire, the cost would be around £3.125 billion a year. That's 0.254% of the national budget a year. State pension currently costs around £150 billion all in. If we assume an inflation-adjusted growth rate of 5% a year, so when I say inflation adjusted, I've knocked a 3% annual inflation rate off the annual average returns of the global stock market of 8%. So the figure that we get at the end has had its purchasing power protected, assuming inflation is at 3%. By the time they hit 18, they'd have around 12k. Parents could add to this over time if they want, but let's just keep it worst case scenario and shout out to my team who built this awesome compound interest calculator. You can add fees and inflation into it. I'll leave a link in the pinned comment below for you. But let's say when they're about 18, 20, whatever, they get a job and over a lifetime they average into their pension £300 a month, made up of employer and employee contributions. They're going to end up with over £700,000 at retirement. Again, that's an inflation-adjusted figure as I knocked the 3% inflation off. And that's enough money to generate an income of around £28,000 a year, which is more than double the current state pension level, with a total cost to the state of £3 billion a year instead of £150 billion a year. If you think the growth rate is high or the contribution rates are high, I hear that. You can play with the figures how you want. And with the contribution stuff, if we do reduce the overall burden of the state pension, there'll be plenty of money sloshing about to boost the auto-enrollment scheme so that there's higher contribution levels. But the point really I'm trying to make is we need to shift away from a pay-as-you-go model to a model that leverages future generations' greatest asset, their time. Because we can amplify returns over their lifetime and let compounding do the heavy lifting, not workers of today. Another benefit of this system is the UK wants investment into the UK stock market. If the government went to parents, I'm going to put 5k into a pension for your kid, I suspect those parents wouldn't be all that bothered if a fixed portion of that, say £1,000, went into the UK markets. At 18, of course, the individual would get full autonomy over where their money was invested. But I also think, you get a lot of adults interested in the stock market and in investing if they saw that their kids' rate of return was outpacing theirs on their own savings. Clearly, there's lots of issues with the suggestion. I think the biggest is you would have to run this scheme alongside the current state pension scheme, and that would happen for a long time because obviously everyone alive today would still need a state pension because they haven't had this time to build up this lifetime pension pot. So the cost for these retirement schemes would actually increase then in the medium term. Now, 3 billion isn't all that much money, and what it does is it ensures long term that our state pension burden starts to reduce. We would see a peak in cost at some point, then every year as people died, the state pension burden would fall away. We would still need some sort of state pension provision as well for people not born here that have moved here and worked there their whole lives, or for people who've fallen through the cracks for whatever reason. Also, that doesn't mean we can't look at the sustainability points around the current state pension now. We need to fix those issues short term. I'll link a video in the end cards, this video that's on screen now, where I talk about that in more detail. Now this suggestion, this pension pot from birth thing, is a lot more radical, isn't it? The political will needed for this is going to be big. Imagine saying to people, your kids are never going to get a state pension. But the way you need to frame this is, you have to say, look, our current system is inefficient because it's pay as you go. What we need to do is create a system that leverages the one asset that kids have more than anyone else, which is time. Also, try shouting at a kid on LBC.